She wasn't performing. She wasn't selling. She wasn't positioning. She was simply enduring. And it was the most powerful thing in the room. Tokyo's most coveted gala. The kind of room where everything, every smile, every dress, every daughter, was a transaction waiting to close. Her family put her in garnet silk to make her sister's emerald look brighter, stood her beside a marble pillar like furniture, and then did what they had been doing for 30 years, used her pain as entertainment for people who would never know her name. He watched all of it from across the room, and he made a decision. What did Kang Hyun-woo, Oyabun of the Ryujin clan, see in a woman her own family called hollow? Why did the most dangerous man in Tokyo walk past a golden, Vassar-educated daughter presented specifically for him and choose the one nobody wanted? What is written in 30 years of surviving quietly that power recognizes before anything else does? Her father accepted the change in terms in under 3 seconds. Her sister's composure cracked for the first time in her life. And the ring he placed on Zara's finger, a black pearl and a platinum dragon, came with words nobody in that ballroom was prepared for. I don't require an heir from her body. I require the fire from her soul. This is the story of a woman who has measured her entire life by a single absence, and a man who looked past every surface and saw something rarer than dynasties. A sword waiting 6 generations for the right keeper. And the question nobody thought to ask. What happens when the woman they made invisible finally steps into full light? Welcome to Afro-Korean Love Tales TV. This is what he saw at the pillar. 30 years invisible. One night, chosen. Let's go. Zara Osei knew exactly what she was. She was the negative space in a family portrait, the shape that made the other shapes look more intentional by comparison. She was the quiet before the music, the shadow that made the light look brighter, the charitable decision her adopted father Richard had made 30 years ago in the fluorescent stillness of an adoption agency that smelled of fresh paint and other people's hope. She had understood her role early. You did not need to be told twice, not when the lesson came dressed in small, daily cruelties, delivered with the precision of people who had been practicing for years. Tonight she wore garnet silk, not because she had chosen it, because it complemented Sofia's emerald gown, and in the Ashworth family, everything Zara wore, did, or became existed in service of Sofia's shine. The dress had been laid on her bed that morning by the family's stylist without a note, without a question, without any acknowledgement that the person who would wear it might have preferences of her own. She had put it on with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped expecting anything different. The Black Diamond Gala was Tokyo's most coveted annual event, held in the grand ballroom of the Imperial Crescent Hotel, a building so deliberately beautiful it felt like an argument. Tonight it blazed. Crystal chandeliers wept light onto floors polished to the depth of still water. The air was dense with hothouse orchids and imported perfume, a sweetness so thick it sat at the back of Zara's throat like a hand pressing gently on her windpipe. All around her, Tokyo's elite moved in their practiced constellations, business dynasties, political families, old money wearing new faces, all of them fluent in the particular language of rooms like this one. Zara stood beside a marble pillar near the east wall. She had found it early in the evening and returned to it the way you return to a known quantity, not because it was comfortable, but because its coldness was honest. Solid. Predictable. The pillar did not look at her and find her lacking. She pressed her back against it and watched Richard work the room, his smile a finely tuned instrument, calibrated differently for each conversation. She watched Sofia hold court near the champagne fountain, golden and glittering and utterly aware of every eye on her. Sofia always knew where the light was.
It's wonderful to
She
finally
moved through
meet
rooms like a woman who had been told from birth that the room
atmosphere
existed
tonight
for
is
her,
absolutely
and had believed it
enchanting,
so
isn't it?
completely it had become true. Zara had learned a different lesson. She had been 30 years old when the final confirmation came. A doctor's office, white walls, the particular silence of a verdict being delivered. Baron. The word had landed in her chest like something dropped from a height, and she had felt, sitting in that chair, that her family had somehow always known. That the way they looked at her, the subtle and not-so-subtle architecture of their dismissal, had been prescient rather than cruel. They had known she was empty before she did. Or that was how it felt, in the cold fluorescent quiet of that office, sitting alone because there was no one to bring. She had not cried then. She didn't cry in front of people anymore. Oh, look. Sofia's voice cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a blade through silk, smooth, and then suddenly not. She had materialized near Zara's pillar with a small cluster of women in her orbit, their faces arranged in expressions of polished amusement. She gestured toward Zara the way you gestured toward something you wanted people to notice but pretended you hadn't engineered. There's my dear sister. Always in the corners. I suppose when you have nothing to add to the room, you learn to become part of the architecture. The women laughed. The sound was crystalline and precise, the laughter of people who understood its purpose. It really is a tragedy, Sofia continued, her voice dropping to something that performed sympathy while delivering the opposite. Such extraordinary bone structure. Such presence when she bothers. A pause, calibrated for effect, but completely hollow inside. Like a beautiful jar with nothing in it. The words were designed to open something up, and they did. They always did. 30 years of such cuts had not made Zara immune. They had simply taught her to bleed inward, to route the damage somewhere below the surface where it couldn't be seen and therefore couldn't be used. She kept her chin level. She fixed her gaze on a point beyond Sofia and her satellites, a trick she had perfected at 12 years old to keep her eyes dry and her face still. She breathed through it the way you breathed through a wave, not fighting it, just waiting for it to pass. She did not know that from across the ballroom. She was being watched. He stood apart from the movement of the room in the way that truly powerful men sometimes did, not with deliberate distance, but with the natural stillness of someone for whom the crowd was background. He was not watching Sofia's performance. He was watching Zara. He had been watching her for several minutes, from the moment his gaze had crossed the room and found her at that pillar, spine straight, chin up, absorbing something that would have broken a lesser person, and standing taller for the effort. Kang Hyun-woo, Oyabun of the Ryujin clan, did not watch rooms the way other people watched rooms. He catalogued them. He read people the way other men read documents, for what they revealed, for what they concealed, for the gap between the two. He had walked into the Imperial Crescent Hotel tonight for one reason. Richard Ashworth had been pursuing an alliance for 2 years, and Hyun-woo had come to close it or end it. He had not expected to find this. He watched the subtle tremor in her fingers before she stilled them. Watched the rigid line of her spine, the way she absorbed the cruelty directed at her and converted it, not into collapse, but into something harder and quieter and more enduring. He watched the women around Sofia titter and preen, and he watched Zara stand in the middle of their small cruelty as if she were a stone and they were rain. He saw her. Not the garnet silk, not the extraordinary bone structure Sofia had mentioned with such performative pity. He saw the woman inside the woman, the fortress that had been built from years of surviving precisely this, the immovable dignity of someone who had been tested so many times that the testing had become part of her structure. She was not broken by this room. She had been forged in rooms like this. Kang Hyun-woo made a decision. It settled in him the way his most important decisions always settled, without drama, without deliberation, with the cold and absolute finality of something that had simply always been true and was only now being acknowledged. Richard appeared at his elbow with the particular energy of a man who had been waiting for an opening. Mr. Kang. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, threaded through with the careful deference of someone who understood the power differential and was performing comfort with it. A genuine pleasure, as always. I trust the evening is meeting your expectations. Hyun-woo's gaze did not leave Zara. He gave a single, barely perceptible nod. The economy of it was its own statement. Richard forged ahead. He was not a man who read silence as well, which was one of many reasons his empire was failing. As we've discussed, the kind of alliance we're proposing, the depth of integration between our enterprises, requires something more personal. A bond that speaks to shared future, shared commitment.
Chairman Lee,
he lifted his
this is my
hand in
daughter,
a gesture
Anne.
of presentation towards
It's an honor to
Sofia,
meet you, sir.
who had materialized
The
at
pleasure
his
is
side
mine.
with the timing
I've
of a
heard
woman
wonderful
who had been
things.
listening for her cue. My daughter Sofia, Vassar educated, trilingual, the future of everything I've built. She will make a remarkable partner. A worthy mother, too. Heirs, Sofia finished, the word landing with a precision that told Zara, standing 30 feet away, exactly what was happening. She recognized the word as a weapon because she had felt it used that way many times. The pointed emphasis. The reminder, wrapped in the language of dynasty, that Zara's specific and permanent limitation was known and relevant and disqualifying. Hyun-woo's gaze finally moved. It shifted from Zara to the father and daughter presenting themselves before him, and what it did next was remarkable in its restraint. He looked at Sofia the way a man looked at a contract he was about to decline, not with contempt, not with cruelty, but with a complete and unambiguous absence of interest. His eyes moved over her once. They did not return. Sofia's smile held, but only just. The crack was small, almost invisible. Zara, who had studied Sofia's face her entire life, saw it from across the room. Richard's confidence began its slow dissolution. Mr. Kang, Sofia is exceptional. She can provide. Hyun-woo raised one gloved hand. A single, minimal gesture. Richard's sentence died in his mouth as if it had been cut at the stem. The silence that followed had weight. Then Hyun-woo's gaze moved again, crossed the ballroom with a slow, magnetic certainty of something that had already decided its destination, and settled on Zara at her pillar. He lifted his chin. Not a gesture of summons, exactly. More the way a man acknowledged something he had already claimed, simply by looking at it. Her, he said. One word. The room didn't hear it, but the people near him did. The word moved outward through the crowd in a ripple of recalibrated attention. The arrangement stands. But I will take her. Richard's face moved through several expressions in quick succession. Disbelief, confusion, the dawning realization of a man watching something he thought he controlled reveal itself as something else entirely. He looked at Zara, his discarded daughter, his charitable burden, his hollow jar, and then back at the most powerful man in the room. He made his calculation in under 3 seconds. The deal was the deal. The terms had simply changed. Zara, across the room, watched the crowd shift. It happened gradually, then all at once. The slow parting of a sea of expensive suits and evening gowns, clearing a path she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to walk. Hyun-woo moved through it with a stillness that was more commanding than any deliberate display of power she had ever witnessed. He didn't perform his authority. He simply had it, completely, the way certain people had things that were simply part of their structure. Her pillar, which had been her shelter all evening, was now a stage. Her heart hammered. She was aware of every eye in the room as a specific and individual pressure, all of them recalibrating around this new and impossible development. She straightened her spine. Old habit, the reflex of a woman who had learned that posture was the one form of dignity no one could take from you, and waited. He stopped before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Up close, he was something else entirely. Tall, with a stillness that was more unsettling than any overt display would have been. His suit was charcoal silk so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, perfectly cut, no adornment except a small silver dragon at his lapel, its single ruby eye catching the chandelier light like a drop of blood that refused to dry. The scent that reached her was sandalwood and clean winter air, not cologne exactly, just the specific atmosphere of a person whose presence changed the quality of the air around them. "You're Zara," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered in a voice that was low and resonant and precise, the voice of a man who did not raise it because he had never needed to. She nodded. Her throat had closed around whatever words she might have found. He studied her face with an attention that was entirely different from the attention she was used to in rooms like this. She was accustomed to being looked at the way furniture was looked at, assessed for its function, found adequate or inadequate, moved on from. This was not that. He was reading her. The fine lines of tension around her eyes, the carefully maintained stillness of her expression, the thing in her gaze that she kept banked low and carefully hidden, the resilience she had spent 30 years being told was irrelevant. He was reading all of it, slowly, without apology. "My name is Hyun-woo," he said, his voice shifting almost imperceptibly, a fraction warmer, a shade more private. Your father and I have concluded a business arrangement. It involves you. The words were transactional. They should have been cold. And yet the way he said them, the way his eyes held hers with a directness that felt more like acknowledgement than assessment, made them feel like something different. Like a door opening rather than a sentence being handed down. Sofia's voice reached them from a few feet away, a controlled explosion. This is absurd. Richard, do something. He cannot possibly. Sophia stopped herself before the word, but its shape was audible in the space she left. He cannot want her. The murmurs of the room swelled around them. Zara heard fragments. She's the one who can't, isn't she? What could he possibly see? This must be some kind of statement, and felt each one as a specific and familiar small impact. She had been the subject of rooms like this her entire life. She knew the exact texture of this particular humiliation. Her body responded the way it had been trained to respond, the instinctive half-step backward, the pull toward disappearance, the desire to be absorbed into the marble and simply cease to be visible. But the pillar was behind her, and Hyun-woo was in front of her, and she found that she could not move in either direction. He did not look at the crowd, did not acknowledge the murmuring with even the flicker of an eye. His entire attention remained on her face, and she watched him become, without any visible effort, a wall. Not physically, he didn't move. But his stillness expanded somehow, became a perimeter, a field. The noise of the room did not stop, but it stopped reaching her with the same force. They are insects, he said, his voice pitched only for her. Their sound means nothing. Then, he did something that sent a new current of shock through the room, without saying a single additional word. He reached out, his movement fluid and unhurried, and with two gloved fingers, he lifted a small curl that had fallen loose from her arrangement and settled it gently behind her ear. The touch lasted less than 2 seconds. It was feather-light, almost nothing. It felt like everything. Not because of what it was, but because of what it meant in a room like this, an act of deliberate, public tenderness from a man whose attention was worth more than most people in the ballroom's entire net worth. A claim made without possessiveness. A statement without words. The insects quieted. Richard materialized, his composure reconstructed and visibly fragile. Mr. Kang, perhaps a private conversation would be more appropriate. I think there may be a misunderstanding about what Zara can, what she's able to. There are certain things you should understand about her situation. Hyun-woo turned his head. Slowly. The movement was so controlled, it was almost more frightening than speed would have been. He looked at Richard with the complete, unhurried attention of a man who had all the time in the world and was choosing to spend a small portion of it on this. There is no misunderstanding, Richard. The first name, in that tone, was not familiarity. It was reduction. I am aware of every detail of her situation. I have been aware of it longer than this conversation. He paused, and in the pause something settled, the specific gravity of words being chosen with absolute precision. You came to me tonight with an offer of a broodmare. You presented your daughter as a vessel, a container for heirs, an instrument of dynasty, a means of producing something useful from a transaction you wanted. His voice had not risen. It did not need to. Every person within 20 feet had gone completely still. I have no interest in your dynasty, Richard. I have an empire. Empires are not sustained by heirs. They are sustained by queens, by loyalty, by a strength that does not require a bloodline to prove itself. He turned back to Zara, and the shift in his gaze, from the cold assessment he had turned on Richard to the specific, direct quality of attention he reserved only for her, was its own declaration. Her limitation, as you call it, is not a flaw. It is a fact that changes nothing about what she is. You offered me what she cannot give you. I am choosing what she is. The room had gone completely silent. Not the polite quiet of a formal pause, but the absolute silence of a space in which something irreversible has just occurred, and every person present understands it. I do not require an heir from her body. His voice carried now, not because he raised it but because the silence carried it for him. I require the fire from her soul. Zara felt the words enter her chest, and rearrange something there. She had been called many things in her life. Quiet, overlooked, limited, hollow, barren, a beautiful jar with nothing in it. She had been the thing her family pointed away from when they wanted to direct attention towards something better. She had been the shadow, the placeholder, the charitable act that had outlived its usefulness. She had been defined entirely by what she lacked, measured entirely against the standard of what she could not produce. No one had ever spoken of her soul. No one had ever looked at her and reached past every surface, past the garnet silk and the careful posture and the 30 years of carefully maintained composure, and said, "There. That is what I see. That is what I am here for." Sofia broke first. "She is nothing." The words came out shrill and unbeautiful, stripped of their usual polish by something that sounded like genuine panic. "She's a charity case. She'll bring you nothing. She'll ruin everything you've." Richard Hyun-woo did not look at Sofia. "Silence your daughter." Richard grabbed Sofia's arm with the reflexive obedience of a man who no longer had any leverage and knew it. Sofia went silent, rigid with fury, her perfect face a mask cracking at every seam. The power of this room had just been entirely redistributed, and Zara Osei was standing at the center of it. Hyun-woo reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a small box of black velvet. He opened it. What was inside was not what she expected. Not a diamond solitaire, not the conventional declaration of the category of transaction this had started as. It was a ring built around a single black pearl, perfectly spherical, deep and lustrous as a night sky that had been compressed into a sphere. The platinum setting coiled around it like a sleeping dragon, precise and purposeful. The pearls seemed to hold light rather than reflect it, as if it were keeping something. It was not a ring for a bride. It was a ring for something else entirely. "Your family built your identity around a single absence," he said, his voice low and private now, audible only to her. "They made you believe that what you could not give was the entirety of what you were. They were wrong." He took her left hand. His grip was steady, grounding, the touch of someone who intended to hold rather than display. Her fingers trembled against his palm. "Your worth is not what you can produce. It is what you have survived. It is who you have remained, despite everything they did to unmake you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It settled there with a weight that was both physical and something else, cool and solid and real, a fact made of platinum and pearl. It fit as if it had been measured for her, which she somehow understood it had. He looked up from her hand to her face, and what she saw in his eyes was not the performance of sentiment. It was something older and quieter than that, something that had already made its decision and was not asking for approval. "From this moment," he said, "you are under my protection. Any insult directed at you is directed at me. Any harm done to you will be answered by the Ryujin clan." He held her gaze with a steadiness that felt like a foundation being poured. "You are no longer their shadow, Zara. You are my empress." His thumb moved over the surface of the pearl, a slow and quiet gesture. The words settled in her chest like something landing after a very long flight. Empress. It was a word that belonged to a different life, a different story, one in which she had not spent 30 years being the margin note in someone else's narrative. It was a word that had never been spoken in the same sentence as her name. And yet, standing in the wreckage of her old story with this man's ring on her finger and his eyes holding hers with absolute certainty, the word did not feel foreign. It felt, against all reason, and against every story she had ever been told about herself, like recognition. "Why?" The word came out before she could stop it. Barely a sound. "Why me?" He didn't answer immediately. He took her hand and led her away from the pillar, away from Richard's stunned face and Sofia's furious silence and the constellation of gawking strangers, toward the wide terrace doors at the far end of the ballroom. The crowd parted as if it had rehearsed this. The path to the doors was clear. Outside, the Tokyo night received them. The terrace overlooked a formal garden that stretched away into ordered darkness, its geometry precise and beautiful, the kind of landscape that had been tended for so long it had achieved the quality of permanence. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of late-season chrysanthemums and something faintly mineral from the koi pond below. The noise of the gala dropped behind them like a curtain being drawn, replaced by the sound of the city in its lower registers, the distant pulse of traffic, the occasional voice, the particular ambient hum of Tokyo at night. He released her hand but stayed close, leaning against the stone balustrade, looking not at the garden but at her. "Because I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who want things from me," he said. His voice had changed out here. The hard public edge was gone, replaced by something more considered and more honest, as if the absence of an audience had given him permission to use a different register. "Power, money, protection, alliance. They offer me their children and their daughters and their carefully constructed loyalties, and every single one of those offers is a transaction dressed as devotion. They see me as a means to an end." He paused. "When I looked across that room tonight and found you, while they were doing what they were doing, I saw the only person in that space who was not performing, not selling, not positioning." His gaze was steady and direct. "You were simply enduring, and doing it with a dignity that shamed every person in the room, including me for not intervening sooner." The garden was very quiet. "They called you hollow," he said. "They called you empty. But what I saw was the opposite. I saw someone who had been forced to become entirely self-sufficient, who had learned, through years of being told her worth was conditional, that it wasn't, who had built something interior that didn't require anyone else's confirmation to stand." He looked at her with the specific attention of someone who had spent a great deal of time thinking about something and had now decided to say it. "That is the rarest thing I have ever encountered in 40 years of watching people. A strength that does not perform itself." A tear moved down her cheek before she could stop it. Not grief, not sadness, something larger and less nameable than either, the specific release of a pressure that had been held for so long it had become structural, and was now, without warning, no longer necessary. She hadn't cried in front of another person in years. She lifted her hand to her face, surprised by the wetness there, embarrassed by the surprise. Hyun-woo watched the tear fall and did not move to intercept it. He seemed to understand, with the instinct of a man who read people as a survival skill, that this was not his to take, that it needed to happen on its own terms. "They tried to make a weapon of your pain," he said quietly, "to wield it against you, to keep you small with it. But pain, held long enough and survived completely enough, does not stay soft." He looked at her with something in his eyes that she didn't have a word for yet, but would spend the coming months learning. "It becomes the hardest thing in you. It becomes the thing nothing can break." Zara found her voice. It came out rough at the edges, worn from the evening, but present. "I don't know how to be what you've described," she said. "An empress. I've only ever known how to be invisible." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Small, almost private, a hint of warmth surfacing through the composed stillness of his face like light through deep water. "Good," he said. "The ones who have lived in the shadows understand the nature of light better than anyone who has always stood in it." He straightened from the balustrade and closed the small remaining distance between them, and she was aware of his height, his warmth, the specific gravity of his presence at close range. He lifted his hand and cupped her jaw with a care that was so deliberate it felt like a conscious decision being made in real time. His thumb moved along her cheekbone, carrying away the trace of her tear. "I don't want a performance from you. I don't want you to learn a role or construct a version of yourself that fits my world." His eyes held hers. "I want you to stand beside me as you are. That is enough. That has always been enough." She looked at him in the Tokyo night, the black pearl cooling on her finger, the sounds of the city moving around them like water around two stones. "I chose you, Zara," he said. The words were quiet and final and completely certain. "Not as part of an arrangement. Not for what you can provide. I chose you because when I saw you in that room, I recognized something I have not found anywhere else in my life, a solitude that is not loneliness, a self-containment that is not coldness, a strength that was not given or cultivated or inherited, but built." A pause. His thumb stilled on her cheekbone. "Your father believes he made a transaction tonight. He is a fool who cannot see past the surface of things. What happened tonight was not a transaction. His voice dropped lower. I have been told, my entire life, that my freedom ended when I assumed this position. That the Oyabun belongs to his clan, his obligations, his legacy, and nothing else. His eyes didn't leave hers. Looking at you tonight, I felt something I have not felt in 20 years. I felt free. The confession sat between them in the cool night air, fragile and enormous. Zara looked at this man, dangerous, precise, powerful beyond anything she had ever stood close to, and felt the specific vertigo of standing at the edge of something vast and irreversible and choosing, against every instinct trained by 30 years of careful self-protection, not to step back. She looked down at the black pearl on her finger, at the dragon coiling around it in platinum, and felt the weight of it settle. Not heavy, exactly. Complete. She looked back up at him and said nothing. There was nothing yet to say, but she did not look away. And so, in the Tokyo night, on the terrace of the Imperial Crescent Hotel with the city humming its indifferent song below them, two solitudes found each other and decided, without ceremony, the months that followed were an education in a language she had never been taught. Not the language of power, she had grown up fluent in that, had spent 30 years learning to read its grammar through the specific cruelties of people who had it and used it carelessly. What she had never been taught, had never been offered even the most basic vocabulary of, was the language of being chosen, of being wanted not as a function or a fixture or a reflection of someone else's worth, but as herself, specifically and entirely, the way Kang Hyun-woo had looked at her across a ballroom and said her. The life she had inhabited before, gray and marginal, lived at the edges of rooms and the edges of families, defined by accumulation of lacks, receded from her the way shorelines receded from ships. Not all at once. Not without a last look. But steadily, and with a finality that surprised her with its completeness. Hyun-woo's home in the hills above Shibuya was not what she had expected of a man who commanded one of Tokyo's most powerful criminal organizations. She had anticipated cold grandeur, marble and severity, the aesthetic language of intimidation. What she found instead was a sanctuary, a home built in the tradition of Japanese architecture at its most considered, dark cedar and aged timber, shoji screens that turned the light from the garden into something soft and indirect, glass walls that dissolved the boundary between inside and outside until the garden felt like another room and the rooms felt like clearings in a wood. Art was everywhere, not displayed, not curated for effect, but simply present, the way things were present in a home where the person living in it had genuine taste rather than performed taste. Books were everywhere. This surprised her most. She had expected weapons, perhaps. She had not expected shelves that ran floor to ceiling in the Eastern Wing, stacked with volumes in 4 languages, some of them so old and so heavily annotated in the margins that the handwriting had become part of the text. She had not expected to find him there, on her 3rd morning, in the early light with a cup of tea and a book that he set down unhurriedly when she appeared in the doorway, as if her presence was simply a pleasant addition to what was already a good morning.
Tea, he said.
The pot is still warm. And then he had picked the book back up, and she had poured herself a cup and settled into the chair across from him, and the silence between them had been not empty, the opposite of empty. Full of a quiet attention that asked nothing of her. She had never experienced silence like that before. In her family's home, silence was either punishment or precursor, the held breath before something cutting. This silence was different. It was the silence of a space that had been made large enough to contain 2 people without requiring either of them to perform. She explored the house in those first weeks the way you explored something you were not yet sure was yours to touch.
Carefully.
With attention. She found the dojo in the Eastern Wing and stood in its doorway for a long time, studying the racks of weapons along the wall, the polished floor, the quality of light that fell through the high narrow windows. She found the bonsai garden, a private courtyard she hadn't known existed until a door she'd assumed was a closet opened onto it, and stood in the cold morning air looking at 20 trees in various stages of their decades-long becoming. She found the kitchen, which was large and organized in the particular way of someone who cooked seriously, and she found the housekeeper, Mrs. Park, who was Korean and efficient and who looked at Zara with an expression of careful assessment before deciding, apparently, that she would do. She was moving through these spaces differently than she had moved through spaces her entire life. She realized this slowly, the way you realized physical changes in yourself, by noticing the absence of something rather than the presence. She was not making herself small. She was not angling her body toward exits. She was not holding the particular tension in her shoulders that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember, the tension of someone who expected, at any moment, to be found wanting. She was simply walking through a home. Her home. The realization arrived one afternoon about 3 weeks in, while she was standing at the window of the East Library watching rain move across the garden in soft diagonal lines. She had been standing there for perhaps 20 minutes, thinking about nothing in particular, and it occurred to her that this was something she had never done before, stood in a space and thought about nothing in particular, without monitoring the room behind her for tone, without calculating exits, without anticipating the next thing that would be required of her. She was simply present. In a room. In her own life. The thought made her eyes sting. She pressed her palm flat against the cool glass and breathed through it. Hyun-woo came to stand behind her without announcing himself. She had learned already that he moved like this, silent and precise, but never in a way that startled her, because there was nothing threatening in his approach. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her back against his chest, resting his chin on her shoulder. The warmth of him was immediate and complete. "What are you thinking?" he murmured against her hair. "That I'm standing here thinking about nothing," she said. "That I've never done that before." She felt the shift in him. Not quite a smile, but the breath that preceded one. "Good," he said. "Nothing is underrated." He held her in the quiet of the rain until the garden went from gray to silver to the particular luminous green that followed a heavy shower, and when she finally turned in his arms to face him, she could not have said how long they had been standing there. Time moved differently in this house.
She was still adjusting to that.
He had a talent for presence that she had never encountered in a person before. Not the performed attention she was used to from powerful people, the studied interest, the eyes that stayed on you to convey that they were staying on you. His attention was simply there, complete and undemonstrative, the way sunlight was there. He didn't make a project of noticing her. He just noticed her. Consistently, fully, without requiring acknowledgement for the act. It was in the tea, every morning, made exactly as she took it without a single conversation about how she took it, as if he had simply observed and remembered as a matter of course. It was in the way his hand would find the small of her back when they stood together in company. Not possessive, not performative, just present. A quiet signal. "I see you. I'm here." It was in the books that began appearing on her bedside table, unmarked, without notes, volumes she would not have chosen herself, on subjects she hadn't known she was interested in, that turned out to be exactly what she would have chosen if someone had known her completely. She found herself watching him. Not with the vigilance she had learned in Richard's house, the constant monitoring for shifts in mood, for warning signs, for the precise moment when the temperature changed. She watched him the way she watched the bonsai garden, with a quality of attention that was closer to appreciation than assessment. She watched the way he handled things, the careful and complete attention he brought to whatever was in front of him, whether it was a document or a conversation or the particular task of carving a piece of cedar in the workshop at the back of the property, which he did on Sunday mornings with the focused quiet of a man who understood that certain activities existed to remind you of your own hands. She watched him and felt something she had no prior experience of, the specific ease of being with a person who did not require you to manage them. This was new. Entirely disorienting new. She had spent her adult life in a state of low-level vigilance, monitoring for the shift in tone that preceded a cutting remark, reading the atmosphere of rooms before she entered them fully, calculating the acceptable range of self she was allowed to occupy in any given moment. It was exhausting in the specific way that constant, invisible labor was exhausting. Not dramatically, not with sharp edges, but with the quiet depletion of someone who had been running at partial capacity for so long they had forgotten what full capacity felt like. In this house, the monitoring was unnecessary. She had tested it carefully in those early weeks, the way you tested ice before trusting your full weight to it. She had waited for the temperature to shift. She had watched for the moment when the warmth of his attention would reveal itself as conditional, predicated on something she hadn't produced yet, contingent on some standard she hadn't yet been told. It never came. The warmth was simply constant, the way the house was simply warm, as a basic feature of the environment rather than something being performed for her benefit. She had never lived inside warmth that was not conditional. She had not understood, before now, how much energy she had been spending simply to stay warm in its absence. One evening she found him in the bonsai courtyard in the last of the autumn light, crouched over one of the older trees with a pair of small scissors, his face wearing the expression she had come to associate with his most concentrated states, not stern, exactly, but entirely present, every available attention on the task. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a while. He knew she was there. He always knew, but he didn't perform awareness of her, didn't make a show of acknowledging her presence. He simply finished what he was doing, with the unhurried certainty of a man who trusted that she would still be there when he was done. He was right. When he straightened and turned to her, his expression opened, a subtle thing, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent weeks learning to read it. A specific relaxation around the eyes, a fractional shift in the set of his mouth. She had come to understand that this was what welcome looked like on him. Not demonstration. Just the quiet, involuntary opening of a face in the presence of someone it recognized as good. "You're learning it," she said, nodding toward the tree. "It takes decades." He looked back at it. "My father started this one. I have perhaps brought it 3% closer to what it will become." He set the scissors down carefully. Bonsai is an exercise in accepting that you are not the point. You are the steward. The tree is the point. She crossed the courtyard and stood beside him, looking at the small, impossibly perfect tree in its shallow dish. That sounds like something an empire builder would find difficult. He considered this. "It sounds like something an empire builder needs," he said. They stood in the falling light, and she felt it again, that profound and slightly unbearable peace. The feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, which was so new and so foreign that her nervous system kept trying to flag it as suspicious.
She was working on that.
She was learning to let the peace simply exist without immediately looking for the flaw in it. "I saw my father on the news today," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It simply came out, the way things did when you were finally in a space where things were allowed to come out. His company. The losses. Hyun-woo was quiet for a moment. "I know." She looked at him. "I withdrew our investment position 6 weeks ago," he said, with the particular evenness of a man stating a fact that has been decided and executed and does not require additional conversation. "And the secondary partnerships that were sustaining the enterprise. There were others who followed once the position changed." He met her gaze. Richard Ashworth built his empire on the confidence of people who believed his was worth backing. Confidence is a fragile architecture. Zara was quiet for a moment. "You did that for me." "I did that because a man who raises a daughter for 30 years and then auctions her to a business partner is a man whose judgment cannot be trusted in any context." He said it without heat, without drama. Just the clean, straightforward delivery of someone who had made a reasonable assessment and acted on it. It was a business decision. She looked at him steadily. "Hyun-woo." He met her gaze and she saw it, the truth that lived just behind the clean language of business logic. The specific warmth that moved through his eyes when she said his name. He did not confirm or deny it. He simply held her gaze and she understood. It was for her. It was his version of justice, delivered quietly and completely, without announcement, without requiring her gratitude, or even her knowledge. He had simply removed the foundation from beneath the people who had spent 30 years diminishing her, the way you removed a stone from under a structure that deserved to fall. She felt something move through her chest that was equal parts grief and gratitude, grief for the years in which no one had thought to do something like this for her, gratitude for the man standing beside her in the autumn light who had done it without being asked and without making it a performance. She reached out, and took his hand. It was the first time she had reached for him. Not the other way. Not in response to his initiative. She reached for him, and she held on. His fingers closed around hers, and the bonsai garden went very still. Welcome back, everyone. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found the story. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. These are the stories I live for, the ones where the overlooked are finally seen. Drop your city in the comments and tell me which moment hit you hardest in part 1. Now, let's continue. The ghost did not disappear overnight. She had expected, perhaps naively, that the move into this new life would be cleaner than it was. That the ring on her finger and the man beside her and the sanctuary of this house would simply overwrite what came before, the way new paint covered old walls. She had not accounted for the fact that old walls remembered. That 30 years of a particular story did not stop telling itself simply because the circumstances changed. The whispers found her in unexpected places. A photograph in a society column, Sofia at some event, draped over the arm of someone new, her caption including a pointed reference to family difficulties. The implication was clear even in the careful language of the press, that whatever Zara had stumbled into was a curiosity, a temporary aberration, a situation that would resolve itself when the powerful man in question came to his senses. She was still in the language of that world, the barren one. The charity case. The jar with nothing in it. She read it on her phone in the garden on a Tuesday morning and felt the old familiar pull, the gravity of the story she'd been told about herself, trying to reassert its claim. The specific shame of it, the way it settled in her chest like a familiar weight. She put the phone down and looked at the bonsai trees for a long time. Then she got up and went inside. She found Mrs. Park in the kitchen and asked, in the careful Japanese she had been studying since her arrival, whether there was anything that needed doing that morning. Mrs. Park looked at her with that assessing expression and then said, in Korean, that the East Library needed dusting if she wanted something to occupy her hands while she was thinking. Zara laughed. It surprised her, a short, genuine sound that she hadn't been expecting from herself. Mrs. Park's expression shifted a fraction toward approval. She dusted the East Library, which took 2 hours because she kept stopping to read passages from the books on the shelves, and when she was done she felt better in the specific way that physical work and the company of someone with no investment in her emotional state could make you feel better. Mrs. Park brought tea, without being asked. They drank it in companionable silence, and Zara thought, this is also a life. This quiet, specific, ordinary morning. This is also what it looks like. She was learning to accumulate evidence against the old story. Every ordinary morning was a piece of evidence. Every cup of tea, made the way she liked it. Every book on the bedside table. Every quiet evening on the veranda watching the city lights come on below the hills, with Hyun-woo's shoulder under her cheek and the sound of his breathing and the specific solidity of a person who is not going anywhere. Evidence, accumulated patiently, became a new story. She had not understood before that this was how it worked. She had assumed that transformation happened in events, that you were struck by something large, and everything shifted in a moment of dramatic clarity. This was not how it happened. It happened in increments almost too small to measure. In the Tuesday morning when she realized she had laughed at something without checking first whether laughter was appropriate. In the afternoon when she chose a fabric for a new dress without thinking about who it would complement. In the evening when Hyun-woo came home distracted and she gave him 20 minutes of silence without monitoring her own response to that silence for signs that she had done something wrong. Small things. Ordinary things. The whole topography of a life changing one unremarkable morning at a time. She began to understand, in those months, something she had not understood in the room where the original verdict had been delivered. Barren had been used as a synonym for insufficient. As though the capacity to produce children was the sum total of a woman's value, and the absence of it left the remainder as exactly zero. She had accepted that equation so completely, had lived inside it so long, that she had stopped being able to see it as the specific cruelty it was. Hyun-woo had not asked her to unlearn it. He had simply behaved, consistently and without ceremony, as though the equation had never been true. He spoke of her as though her presence in his life was self-evidently valuable, not to compensate for the absence of something else, not as a consolation, but as the straightforward fact of a woman he had chosen for precisely who she was. Over months of watching him live by this assumption, she began, cautiously and imperfectly, to share it. One afternoon, he came home from a long day at a pace she had learned to read, contained but carrying something, the particular quality of stillness that meant the day had been demanding in ways he was processing rather than displaying. She was in the library when she heard him come in. She didn't go to him immediately, understanding that he required a few minutes of decompression before company was welcome. She had learned his rhythms the way she had learned everything about him, by watching, by paying the kind of attention that asked nothing in return, which happened to be exactly the kind of attention he required and rarely received. 20 minutes later, he appeared in the library doorway. She looked up from her book. Difficult day. Manageable, he said, which was what he said when the answer was yes, but he was choosing to put it in perspective. She set the book down and patted the space on the wide leather sofa beside her. He crossed the room and sat, and the tension in him began, almost immediately, to release. She could see it in the incremental relaxation of his shoulders, the way his breathing slowed and deepened. She didn't ask him to talk about it. She had learned that he would talk about what he could talk about, and the rest he carried in that specific interior way of people who had spent their lives responsible for things that couldn't be shared. After a while he said, "There's a situation with the Osaka connection. It will require a formal meeting. Probably next week. Do you need me there?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "If you're willing." She thought about the first time he had taken her to a formal meeting, a dinner at a Ginza restaurant 3 floors underground, where she had sat beside him at a table of men who had looked at her with a particular quality of assessment that came with large power at close range. She had been terrified, and she had not shown it, and the not showing had been easier than she'd expected because Hyun-woo's hand had been at her back and his presence had been a wall, and she had discovered, sitting at that table, something useful about herself, that she was not frightened of powerful men. She had grown up surrounded by a man who used power carelessly, who swung it like a blunt instrument. She understood the difference between that and what Hyun-woo was, a man who used power with the precision of someone who understood its weight. "I'll be there," she said. He nodded, and something in him settled further. She understood that her willingness to enter his world was its own form of gift, not because he required it or had asked for it, but because it told him something about the nature of what they were building. She was not standing at the gate of his life and asking to be protected from it. She was walking into it beside him, clear-eyed and present, which was the only way she knew how to do anything. They sat together as the light changed in the library, the Tokyo dusk turning the room from gold to amber to the specific blue-gray that preceded dark, and neither of them said very much, and the silence between them was exactly the kind it had always been between them, not empty, not charged, not requiring navigation.
Full.
The kind of silence that only existed between people who had stopped needing to perform for each other. At some point his arm came around her shoulders, and she settled into the curve of it, and she thought about the woman who had stood against a marble pillar in garnet silk 6 months ago, holding herself together with the discipline of someone for whom falling apart had never been an option, and felt a complicated tenderness for her. That woman had not known what was coming, had not known that the same night that had delivered its latest installment of small cruelties was also about to deliver the thing that would change everything. She thought about the word her father had used in the doctor's office, and the way it had traveled with her for 10 years like luggage she couldn't put down. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum for a moment, a habit, checking for the weight of it. It was lighter than it had been, considerably lighter. "You're thinking loudly again," Hyun-woo said against her hair. "Occupational hazard," she said. "Of what occupation?" "Surviving things." She felt him go still for a moment. Then his arm tightened around her, not dramatically, just slightly, just enough. A quiet acknowledgement. "I know. I see it. You survived." They stayed like that until dark came fully into the library, and neither of them moved to turn on a light, content to sit in the gathering dark of a room full of books and the particular peace of two people who had found each other after very long periods of being alone and were in no hurry to take that for granted. This, Zara thought, is what they were trying to take from me. When they made me small, when they called me empty, when they measured me against what I could not give, this is what they were trying to make sure I never found. This specific and ordinary and profound thing. They did not succeed, she thought. And felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, completely free. Winter came to the hills above Shibuya the way it came to most beautiful things, slowly and without apology. The bonsai courtyard was bare now, the trees stripped to their essential shapes, which turned out to be their most honest shapes. Zara had noticed this in late November, standing in the cold morning air with a cup of tea, watching the last of the small maples relinquish their leaves, and thinking that there was something to learn from trees that became most themselves in the season that took everything ornamental away. She had mentioned this to Hyun-woo, and he had looked at her for a moment with that particular expression, the one she had come to recognize as him filing something away, keeping it, giving it a place in his interior catalog of things worth holding, and said nothing. But that evening a small volume on the philosophy of Japanese garden design had appeared on her bedside table, annotated in his handwriting in the margins. This was how he said things he didn't say. She had become fluent in that language. In the tea. In the books. In the specific quality of his attention when she walked into a room, that almost imperceptible opening in his face that he could not fully control and had long since stopped trying to. She had become fluent in the weight of his hand at her back and the specific warmth of silence between two people who trusted each other with it. She had also become fluent, more slowly, and with considerably more resistance from her own nervous system, in the world he occupied outside this house. The formal meetings had continued. Monthly, sometimes more. Dinners in the private rooms of establishments that had no names on their doors and whose locations she would have had no way to find without him. Conversations conducted in the careful, coded language of men who had spent their lives saying important things in rooms that might be listened to. She had learned to sit at these tables with the particular stillness that was her inheritance, the same stillness she had used against marble pillars in ballrooms, turned now toward a different purpose. Not survival. Presence. She noticed that the men at these tables watched her with a progression of attention. First, assessment, the evaluation of an unknown variable, the quiet attempt to determine whether she was a liability or an asset. Then, over subsequent meetings, as she asked precise questions and remembered everything and offered observations at the moments when they were most useful and was silent at the moments when silence was more powerful than speaking. Respect. Not the performed respect of men managing a situation, but the actual respect of people who had encountered someone unexpected and revised their estimate. Hyun-woo had watched this progression with something she could only describe as quiet satisfaction, the expression of a man who had made a correct assessment early and was watching the evidence of that assessment accumulate. "You're doing something at these meetings," she told him one evening, walking back to the car after a dinner in Akasaka, their breath visible in the cold air. "You're waiting for something. Am I? You introduce me. You let me settle. And then, at some point, there's a moment you step back. Just slightly. And you wait." He looked at her with the particular attention of someone being accurately read. "And what do I wait for?" "For me to handle it myself," she said. "You're showing them who I am. But you're making me show them. Not doing it for me." He was quiet for a moment as they reached the car. He opened her door before the driver could. "When you walk into a room," he said, "I want them to follow you because you have earned their regard. Not because I have instructed them to extend it." He met her eyes. There is a difference. She understood the distinction. She also understood what it cost him, a man who had absolute authority in every room he entered, choosing to make space for her authority to exist independently of his. That was not a small thing to give. She knew how much it meant because she knew what the alternative looked like. She had spent 30 years watching men who couldn't give it. "Thank you," she said. "You did the work," he said simply, and got in the car. She looked out the window at Tokyo moving past in the dark and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman discovering the dimensions of herself, finding edges she hadn't known were there, testing weight on foundations she'd been told were weak, and finding them solid, unshakable, built from exactly the material her family had told her was a liability. Her silence, her stillness, her capacity to sit in difficult rooms without flinching, learned from 30 years of sitting in difficult rooms. The keen, cataloging attention she had developed as a survival skill now turned outward rather than inward. The ability to read people, to see the gap between what they displayed and what they were, that she had cultivated in a family where that gap was the most important geography to understand. Every tool they had tried to make her feel ashamed of had turned out to be exactly what this life required. She thought about this often. Not with triumph. Triumph required an adversary, and she had long since stopped thinking of Richard and Sofia as adversaries. They had become, in her mind, simply the circumstances that had produced her, the particular pressures that had formed whatever she was now. Like the bonsai trees, she thought. The shape you become under the hands of people who mean you harm. She had mentioned this to Hyun-woo once, on one of their early mornings, and he had looked at the garden and said, "The difference is that the tree has no choice about its shaper. You survived yours and then chose your own. That is the whole story." She turned it over often, that sentence. Chose your own. The verb was the point of it, not that she had escaped, not that she had been saved, but that she had chosen. That the night at the Black Diamond Gala had not happened to her in the passive sense of things happening to people who have no agency. She had been standing at that pillar, absorbing what was thrown at her, choosing each time to stay upright. She had been choosing for 30 years, in the particular limited way available to her, and the choosing had built something. And then a man had looked across a room and offered her a larger choice, and she had said yes. With her silence, with her presence on that terrace, with the hand she had allowed him to take, she had said yes. She owned that. It was hers. She had walked into this life on her own feet. On a morning in late January, Hyun-woo led her to a part of the property she had not yet been shown. She had learned that the estate had depths that revealed themselves gradually, as if the house itself were practicing a kind of patience, offering itself up in installments. She had found the workshop in October, the private meditation room in November. This was something different. He slid open a heavy door in the east wing she had assumed was a storage room, and what lay beyond it was a dojo. Small and traditional, its wooden floor polished to a mirror depth, the air holding the specific quality of a space that had been maintained with discipline over time. Clean wood, clean silence, the faint mineral scent of steel. Racks of practice weapons lined one wall. Windows set high and narrow allowed light in without distraction. At the far end, separated from the dojo space by a low screen, was a smaller room. She stood in its doorway and understood immediately that this room was different from the rest of the house. The rest of the house, for all its beauty and its accumulated meaning, was inhabited space, a place where life happened, where people ate and thought and read and were simply present. This room had a quality of the sacred. Not religious, exactly, but of the category of places where important things had been held for a long time, and the holding had become part of the architecture. In the center, on a simple wooden stand, rested a sword. Its scabbard was lacquered in a black so deep and so lustrous it seemed almost liquid, inlaid with a dragon in mother-of-pearl, its scales catching the light in shifting iridescent fragments. It was unlike anything she had seen in the dojo's weapon racks. Those were tools. This was something else. This was an object that had outlived its practical function and become something richer, the material form of a story, a lineage, a set of decisions made over generations. Hyun-woo came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a long moment, and she let the quiet exist, understanding from the quality of it that whatever he was about to say required the space that silence made. "The Ryujin Maru," he said finally. His voice had a quality she had heard from him only rarely, the reverence that appeared when he spoke of the very few things he considered genuinely sacred. "The soul of my clan. It has passed from Oyabun to Oyabun for 6 generations. My grandfather carried it. My father carried it." A pause. "I carried it." She looked at the sword, not at him. She understood instinctively that he needed her to receive this, without the pressure of eye contact. There is a tradition, he continued. The Oyabun's wife is the sword's keeper. Not its wielder, its keeper. The distinction matters. He glanced at her briefly. The Oyabun is the blade, the edge, the force, the action. The keeper is what makes the blade worth having, the protector of its purpose. Without a keeper, a blade is just weight. It is the keeper who ensures that the weight means something. He moved to the stand and drew the blade a few inches from the scabbard. The steel sang one clear, high note in the quiet room, a sound so pure it felt less like a sound than a statement, the distilled voice of something very old and very certain. The exposed length of blade was a mirror, flawless, a line of cold light. My mother kept this sword, he said. Her mother before her. They were strong women. He slid the blade back with a soft, final click. But they were keepers by inheritance, born into the role, given the sword because the structure required it. He turned to her, and she saw in his face the specific expression she had learned to read as the outer surface of something he was choosing to be vulnerable about. Not soft, not uncertain, but open. Deliberately open in the way of someone who has decided that openness is worth the risk. You would be the first keeper who is chosen. Not by blood, not by structure, but by what you are. She met his gaze. I have trusted you with many things this year, he said. With the details of my business. With the men who work for me. With the rooms where important things happen, and the silences between the important things, and the version of me that exists before I put on what the world requires. His eyes held hers with a complete, unguarded attention she had spent a year learning was the most honest version of him. I am asking you now to hold something that contains all of the above. The history of what I come from. The obligations that define me. The lineage that will outlast me. He paused. I am asking you to hold my soul, Zara. He lifted the sword from the stand with both hands, his palms flat, and held it out to her. She looked at the sword for a long moment. She thought about garnet silk and a marble pillar and a woman who had spent 30 years learning to make herself smaller and smaller until she almost disappeared entirely. She thought about a black pearl on a platinum dragon and a terrace overlooking a formal garden and a man who had said fire from her soul and meant it in every word. She thought about the bonsai trees and the library and the tea made exactly as she liked it and the books on the bedside table and the specific warmth of a silence between two people who had stopped needing to perform for each other. She thought about the doctor's office. The white walls. The word that had landed in her chest like something dropped from a height, and the decade she had spent carrying it. She thought about the way her family had used it, not once, not explicitly, but constantly, in the accumulated architecture of all the things they had said and done and left unsaid. The way Baron had become not just a medical fact, but an identity. The whole complex structure of her smallness built on that single word, that single absence. She held the sword. And she thought, I was never empty. They were. The people who needed her to be nothing so that they could feel like something, they were the hollow ones. The jar with nothing in it was not her. It was the story they had needed her to inhabit so they could avoid looking at their own. And she had been so thoroughly inside that story for so long that she had forgotten it was a story at all. Had forgotten that stories could be put down. That you could walk out of one and into another if someone held the door open long enough and wide enough for you to understand that there was another one to walk into. He had held the door. She had walked through it herself. The weight of it was immediate and real and nothing like she had expected. Not the weight of steel alone, but the other weight, 6 generations of it, the accumulated meaning of an object that had been held by people who had made difficult decisions and survived difficult things and passed this forward as proof that surviving was possible. She felt it in her palms and in her forearms and somewhere further in the specific place where things settled when they were true. She held it carefully. She held it completely. And she understood, holding it, that this was the final word in a sentence that had begun 6 months ago in a Tokyo ballroom when a man had looked across a room full of people performing their worth and found, in the one person not performing, the only thing he had ever truly wanted. Tears came, the same way they had come on the terrace that first night, not from sadness, but from the particular pressure of being recognized. of being seen so completely and so accurately that the self you had been carrying alone for years was finally witnessed by another person, and the weight of carrying it alone was, in that witnessing, released.
She did not try to stop them this time.
Hyun-woo watched her, and his expression did what it did only rarely, and only in these private moments. It opened completely, the composure that was his habitual face giving way to something unguarded and real and entirely his, the face of a man who had found the thing he had not known he was looking for and was allowing himself, carefully and with full awareness of what it meant, to feel it. He stepped forward and placed his hands over hers where they held the sword, steadying the weight. "You are the keeper," he said quietly. She looked up at him, the sword between them, the cold winter light coming through the high narrow windows, the house around them breathing its particular quiet breath. "I know," she said. She had known, she thought, since the terrace. Since the black pearl and the dragon, and the words that had rearranged something fundamental in her chest. She had been learning toward this moment for 6 months, accumulating evidence, and building the vocabulary for a version of herself that had always existed but had needed, not permission exactly. Witness. She had needed to be seen clearly enough and completely enough that the seeing became indistinguishable from truth. He had done that. Consistently, patiently, without requirement. He had simply looked at her and told her the truth about what he saw, and over time the truth had replaced the lie that had been there before. She was not an empty vessel. She was the keeper of a dragon soul. Spring came early that year. The plum trees in the garden bloomed before February had finished, their white flowers appearing overnight like a decision that had been building for months and finally chose its moment. Zara stood at the East Library window on the morning she noticed them and felt the specific sweetness of a season arriving ahead of schedule, as if the world, too, was in a hurry to get to some. Life had not become simple. She did not want simple, had never particularly wanted it, though she had spent years accepting its opposite as her permanent condition. The Ryujin clan had its complications. Hyun-woo's world was not the civilian world, and she had made peace with that in the clear-eyed way of someone who had decided that pretending otherwise served no one. There were dinners that required her complete attention, and meetings where the subtext was more important than the text, and occasional phone calls at odd hours that sent him to his study for long stretches of quiet she had learned not to disturb. She had also found, in this world, something she had not anticipated. A form of usefulness she had never had access to before. The women of the men Hyun-woo did business with were a particular community, shaped by the same requirements as she was, inhabiting the same peripheral position, managing the same gap between public life and private knowledge. She had begun to know them over the months of formal dinners, in the small margins of those evenings, in the conversations that happened after the main business was concluded, in the particular candor of women who understood each other's circumstances without needing them explained.
She was good at this.
She had always been good at it, the attention, the memory, the ability to hold a person's specific details and return them later in a way that communicated genuine regard. She had been told, by the architecture of her family, that these skills were invisible and therefore worthless. She was discovering that they were neither. They were, in a world built on information and trust, and intelligence gathered in rooms where powerful men assumed the women were merely decorative, they were the sharpest tools she possessed. She moved through those dinners with a growing confidence that was not performance. It was simply the natural expression of a woman who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. She asked questions that were good questions. She listened in the way she had always listened, completely, cataloging, retaining, and when she offered something to a conversation, it landed with the weight of genuine contribution rather than the careful lightness of someone who is not sure of her welcome. She was sure of her welcome. She had earned it. That was different from being given it, and she understood the difference completely. Hyun-woo noticed. He noticed everything. "You've made an ally of Matsuda's wife," he said one evening. Not quite a question. "We understand each other," Zara said. He looked at her for a moment. "That alliance," he said carefully, "is more strategically valuable than the one I've been working toward with Matsuda for 3 years." She smiled. "I know." He laughed. That rare, warm, genuine sound that filled a room and made her feel, every time she heard it, like she had done something genuinely right with her day. "You are terrifying," he said, with a warmth that made it the opposite of a criticism. "I learned from the best," she said. "And the worst. Mostly the worst." He crossed the room and put his arms around her, pulling her in the way he had come to pull her, not possessive, not performative, simply the particular warmth of a person who had found their place and settled into it. She put her face against his neck and felt his heartbeat, steady and real, and thought, This is what was on the other side. Of all of it. The 30 years of being made small, the doctor's office, the garnet silk, the marble pillar. This specific and ordinary and extraordinary thing, standing in a house that was hers, in the arms of a man who had looked at her and chosen her, the keeper of a sword that held 6 generations of trust, learning daily the dimensions of a self that had always been larger than she'd been allowed to know. "What are you thinking?" he murmured.
About all of it, she said.
"From the beginning." And she was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the glass, the plum blossoms moved in a light wind, white against the pale morning sky, unhurried and entirely themselves. "I think," she said, "that everything that happened to me happened so that I would know exactly what this costs and exactly what it's worth."
She paused.
"And I think I'm the luckiest woman in Tokyo." He held her tighter. She felt the smile against her hair. "No," he said quietly. "I am the luckier one. By considerable measure." She did not argue. She had learned, over these months, the particular art of receiving what was true without immediately deflecting it, of standing in the full light of being valued and not flinching away, of saying thank you without qualifying it, without diminishing it, without immediately finding reasons why the gift was less than it appeared to be. She was still learning. She suspected she would be learning for a long time. But she was learning, which was more than she had been able to say in any previous chapter of her life. The plum blossoms moved in the morning light. The house breathed around them. Somewhere in the east wing, the Ryujin Maru rested on its stand in the small and sacred room, its lacquered scabbard holding its 6 generations of history, waiting patiently to be carried into the next one. Waiting for its keeper. And that is where we leave Zara Osei, not at the beginning of a story, but somewhere in the beautiful middle of one that finally belongs to her. She came to that ballroom as a ghost, and she left it as a queen, not because a powerful man chose her, but because she had always been a queen, and she had simply, finally, been seen. True strength is not loud. It doesn't announce itself or demand witnesses. It is the thing that remains after everything else has been stripped away, the spine that holds when the rest of the structure is shaking, the quiet refusal to be unmade by people who never deserved the power they wielded over you. Zara knew what that strength was. She had been building it for 30 years. She just needed someone to hold the light long enough for her to see it herself. I hope this story found you at the right moment. If it did, hit that like button and leave me a comment. Tell me what stayed with you, what you're carrying, what you're building. Subscribe so you never miss the next story, where the underestimated finally come into their own. These stories exist because of you, and I am grateful for every single one of you who makes it to the end. Until next time, stand tall in your own light. It was always yours.